In the previous lecture, we looked at Plato and at the Pythagorean school that seems to have influenced him rather substantially. We introduced at the end his dialogue, the Timaeus, which is his work that contains most of the explicitly natural philosophical content of Plato's corpus. But let me warn you once again that we don't want to study the history of science just to look at things that are rigidly alignable to our own ideas of what science is supposed to be. Plato's contributions to the entire history of science depend also upon the way he set the foundations of the ways to think about the world. What is important in the world? That is his ontology and his epistemology. What sort of ideas should we have in mind for looking at the natural world? Well, in this lecture, what we're going to do is look at the Timaeus that I introduced briefly last time, and look at it in a bit of detail for not only the explicitly scientific ideas in it, but also why is Plato doing this? What's the point of the Timaeus? It seems in effect to stand out from his other dialogues because he doesn't really show very much interest in natural philosophy explicitly elsewhere. Okay, well, let me first just reiterate why the Timaeus is important to historians of science. First of all, as I said last time, it was the only work of Plato known to the Latin-speaking world, the medieval world. Everything else of Plato was lost until it was recovered only in the 15th century during the Italian Renaissance. It contains the majority of Plato's explicitly natural philosophical statements. It also contains one thing that's fired the imagination for centuries. This is the original location of the story of Atlantis, the great power in the Atlantic that was overwhelmed by natural disaster and sunk forever into the sea. So people have always been interested in chasing Atlantis, and that comes out of the Timaeus. Well, the main discourse of the Timaeus deals with the origin of the world and its structure and its contents. What Plato says he wants to give is what he calls a likely account of the way things came to be. We can't have necessarily absolute knowledge of how it came to be, but what he gives is a likely account. Well, in the beginning, so to speak, the demiurge creates the world. Now, what is the demiurge? Well, this is a divine and eternal being who is a creator god. Be careful, however, to separate Plato's demiurge from Christian, Jewish, or Muslim ideas of a creator. He is not omnipotent, so that's one clear difference. Moreover, there are other things that are eternal with the demiurge, matter being one of them, and the other being the forms. Okay? So the demiurge does not create out of nothing like the Christian God. He is eternal, but he's co-eternal with matter and the forms. He does, however, put the world together. How does he do it? He does it the way a carpenter builds a house, from a blueprint. What's the blueprint? The forms. So the demiurge grabs this matter, this eternal matter, and forms it into the universe, but always looking at the forms as his models. But there's a problem. Remember, he didn't create the matter, and it fights him. It's imperfect. It's not good enough to take the forms adequately. So even though the demiurge tries to make the best possible world, and in fact he does make the best possible world, it is under the restrictions that are imposed by the obtuseness, the inability of matter to take the forms properly. So he does the best he can. He's entirely good, but matter thwarts him. What does the universe look like? Well, according to what is said in the Timaeus, it is spherical. The sphere is the perfect shape with all points on its surface equidistant from the center. This sphere rotates, right, because that's the kind of motion that it can have. It can't have up-down motion, which is impossible because there's nothing outside the universe. It can't have left-right motion because, again, there's nothing outside that universe. And so it has the last kind of motion, which is staying in the same place but still moving, in other words, rotating. Plato also says that the universe is alive. Now, what does he mean by that? He calls it an animal. Right? He means that it is ensouled. It has some kind of soul to it, a soul of the world, as it was later called. What is important is that the universe is put together full of harmonies and mathematical intervals. And here the debt to Pythagoreanism is very clear. In fact, the debt to Pythagoreanism may be clear in the very first line of the Timaeus, because it opens with Socrates counting the people who are there to talk about this subject. It begins 1, 2, 3, and where's the fourth? 1, 2, 3, 4. Add them up, what do you get? You get 10, the perfect Pythagorean number, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, the basis of the Pythagorean tetrachus. Well, how do the heavens move? Well, there are heavenly spheres that guide the motions of the sun, the moon, and the planets. If we were to take a rocket ship through Plato's universe, starting from the Earth, which is immobile at the center, okay, we would proceed upwards, and first we would pass the moon, then the sun, then Venus, then Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then finally the stars at the furthest point. Right? So they're in order. And the motions of the heavenly spheres keep the motions of the planets, the sun and the moon, in order. They are mathematically harmonious, their motions are regular, they're kept constantly within proper bounds. And as we'll see in a moment, this constancy of motion, being kept in proper bounds, in an orderly, harmonious way, is really what Plato's message is about here. We'll get back to that, though. Now let's move from the impossibly big to the impossibly small, from the universe itself to the basic building blocks of matter, because the Timaeus presents something very interesting, which we might call a geometrical atomism. What does the demiurge do when he's creating stuff in the world? Well, he takes the matter first and he fashions it into triangles, into two kinds of triangles: right isosceles triangles, that is, right angles where two sides are of the same length, and right scalene triangles, that is, right triangles where no two sides are of the same length. Why triangles? Well, they're the simplest plane figure. So he's gone from a chaotic mass of matter that has no shape to it and makes a simple plane figure. Then he takes those triangles and he makes them into what are called the kalista somata, the most beautiful bodies. What are the most beautiful bodies? Well, they're what we call, in honor of Plato, the Platonic solids. They are the polyhedra that are regular and have faces which are all of the same type. That is, the cube, for example, has 6 faces, all of them squares. The tetrahedron has 4 faces, all of them triangles. The other perfect or Platonic solids are the octahedron with 8 sides, the dodecahedron with 12 sides, and the much more difficult to draw icosahedron with 20 sides. Right. Why does the demiurge do this? Well, 4 of these polyhedra represent the 4 Empedoclean elements. The cube is earth, the tetrahedron is fire, the octahedron air, and the icosahedron water. And these elements then go on to form more complex bodies. I should mention that Plato also says that these bodies, these Platonic solids, these geometrical atoms, if you want to call them that, we should be careful not really to call them atoms because they're not indivisible like Democritean atoms. They are divisible. They can be broken down into their triangles. Nonetheless, he says that they come in different sizes because he recognizes there are, for example, different kinds of fire. There's flame, there's heat, there's the glowing ember, and there's one other that he mentions which is very important, and that is the fire in the eye. Now, what he means by that is he's created a theory of vision. And we're going to talk more about theories of vision later, but Plato's theory of vision is that a fire in the eye causes a visual ray to be emitted. And when that visual ray encounters things elsewhere, it tells us that they're there. So this is what is called an extromissive kind of vision. That is, it's not light coming into the eye, it's something going out of the eye. This is a ray, a visual ray. And that's a fire, he calls it. That would prove to be very influential later on. The elements now can interconvert. This is contrary to what Empedocles says. Empedocles says you've got these four roots of things, and they don't fall apart. They are always constant. But for Plato, the elements interconvert. And because they're geometrical, it's very easy to make them interconvert because they fall apart into their triangles and go back together into a different form. So, for example, we take two atoms, so to speak, two particles of fire, two tetrahedra, put them together, four sides, put them together, you get 8 sides, you get a particle of air out of two fire. Okay? Why are these particular solids connected to the particular elements they are? Well, if you think about it, it'll make sense. The tetrahedron has the sharpest angles. Well, sure enough, when you put your hand over the fire, you can feel it prickling you. You can feel those points, those sharp apices of the tetrahedra. Water is the icosahedron. Well, that makes sense too, because with 20 sides, it's the one that approaches a sphere the most. So imagine if you had a handful of little icosahedra, they would roll out of your hand the way a fluid does. So they'd roll on one another. Contrast that to a cube, which is Earth. Cubes don't roll very well. Okay? So the Earth is solid because it's made up of little cubes. Clearly, this theory, like a great deal of the Timaeus, owes a lot to Pythagoreanism. The numbers, the proportions, the geometry, the mathematics, and remember, for the Greeks, mathematics generally means first and foremost geometry, is encapsulated in the smallest bits of matter, just as it's embodied in the largest thing, the universe itself, which is perfectly spherical. Now, Plato deploys this theory, this geometrical atomism, if you'll let me call it that, to talk about the natures of a wide variety of substances. He talks about metals and minerals. Interestingly, he says that the metals are all a kind of water. Now, why would he say that? Well, because you put them in a fire and they melt into a fluid. So he considers metals to be a kind of water. They happen to be solid at room temperature, but they are fusible. Gold is composed of the finest particles, and it's the most uniform. That's why it's so stable, so resistant to corrosion. Well, after this theory, a considerable portion of the Timaeus deals with human anatomy and physiology. Now, the demiurge creates just about everything, but he doesn't create the human body, curiously enough. Instead, he creates lower deities, and those lower deities are the ones that create the body. The soul itself, however, is created directly by the demiurge. So straight away, there's a hierarchy here. The soul is made by the master craftsman, right? Whereas the body is made by the lower deity. So the soul, for Plato, is very clearly more important than the body. We are souls trapped in bodies, Plato. The parts of the human body, though, these deities that made the human body aren't hacks. They knew what they were doing, and they sat down and considered very carefully how to make the human body to be the best possible. All the parts of the human body are designed to fit very specific functions. Now, there's a funny part here in the Timaeus, and I think we tend to overlook the humor that our ancient characters had. We don't naturally associate humor with Plato or Aristotle, but they were human beings, and as Aristotle would say, risibility, the possibility of laughter, is essential characteristic of humanity. Well, Plato, I think, has a little fun here because he describes why all the different parts of the body are needed. And he says, well, if you just had a head, it would roll around on the ground and get caught in ditches and wouldn't be able to get out. So it needs a body to pull itself out of the ditch. Well, if you remember a couple of lectures ago, I think probably what this is a bit of a slap at Empedocles, who had pieces of the elements coming together in random fashions, and he's got eyeballs rolling around on the earth and arms without shoulders. So I think that's a bit of a slap against Empedocles' randomness in nature. All right, well, that's a brief overview of the Timaeus. But we can't just leave it here. We have to contextualize it. Timaeus was written for very specific purposes by a person with very specific ideas. He's not writing for us, as much as we might like to think that. He's not writing for us. He's writing for his contemporaries, his 4th century BC Athenian citizens. What's it all about? Why is he interested in cosmology and biology and other natural philosophical topics? Well, first of all, to answer that, the Timaeus is part of a trilogy. It's intimately linked, first of all, to the Republic. In fact, the opening of the Timaeus refers to the discussion of the ideal state and the ideal citizens and the governance of the ideal state as being a conversation that had happened the day before. Okay? So the Timaeus is slapped right up against that. The third part of the trilogy is the Critias, that talks more about the Atlantis story. Unfortunately, it's not finished, so we don't actually know what Plato intended to do with it, but it takes place as the next day of conversation. So 3 days of conversation: Republic about the ideal state, Timaeus about the creation of the world, and Critias about ancient Athens and ancient Atlantis. By ancient, I mean 9,000 years before Plato's time, so he says. Well, the cosmology and the other natural philosophical claims made in the Timaeus can be seen as part of Plato's big project, his major project, his most important project of how to order the individual and the state properly. The message that Plato drills into us time and time again throughout the Timaeus is that the world is created and governed by mind. It is not a chance production. It is put together by mind, rationally and in an orderly way. The implication of this, if we take the link with the Republic seriously, is that if the world, the universe, down to its smallest parts, up to its largest parts, is intelligently ordered, then the individual must be governed by intelligent order as well, and so must society. These things are too important to be left to mere chance. The universe doesn't come together as chance. How on earth can we allow a society to function merely on chance? Random whims of the people in it. Just as each part of the human body is designed to fulfill a specific function, so too each member of society should be educated, designed to fulfill a specific function in the whole. Now, the story of Atlantis fits into this very, very well. Atlantis was an extremely powerful empire outside the Straits of Gibraltar. It says it's larger than Africa and Asia combined, which would make it quite large. 9,000 years before Plato's time, the ancient Athenians led a force, an alliance, that defeated the Atlanteans. The only way they were able to do this is because their society was so well ordered. Everybody knew exactly what to do, what his job was, and they functioned as a harmonious whole. Right? So, the Critias tells us, and parts of the Timaeus tell us, that the ancient Athenians had an orderly society. As a result, they had great power to defeat the strongest force of that time. The Timaeus tells us that the world is orderly. We in our society needs to be that way too. Now, one really important thing about the Timaeus that we have not yet mentioned, and this was in fact perhaps its most important function. Natural philosophy, the study of nature, the study of the world, plays an essential role in learning how to live rightly as an individual. Plato makes a very bold claim about knowledge. Knowledge transforms the knower. Knowledge transforms the knower. What does that mean? He means that a person's choice of objects of contemplation transform his soul into the image of those objects of contemplation. Therefore, think what that means. Knowledge of the cosmic harmony, knowledge of the perfection of the world, knowledge of how everything fits together in exactly the right way in design makes our soul harmonious and perfect. Okay? What a person has to do is to look up at the heavens, and you see how orderly it is. Plato knew about these Babylonian records too. There hadn't been any change in the heavens. The moon and the sun appear and disappear from our heavens in regular ways. We see those orderly heavenly revolutions, and it makes our internal turnings of our mind orderly and harmonious. The universe is put together by reason. We have to be governed by reason as well. Knowledge helps us overcome the disorder that comes upon us because of our birth. In our birth, our souls made by the demiurge are stuck in these second-rate bodies made by second-rate deities. Okay? And confusion, disorder is a result. The majority of people have disordered thinking, non-harmonious thinking. And the way to transcend that, to live the good life, is to look up to the heavens to see the regular workings of reason, and then imitate that in ourselves. Now, interestingly enough, at the end of the dialogue, Plato makes some comments about where animals come from. This might be slightly tongue-in-cheek, or it's not clear exactly how he means it. He says that animals come about from unfit humans. Remember, he's got an idea of rebirth, of transmigration of souls. Well, how about birds? Where do birds come from? Well, birds come from people who are mild-mannered and harmless, but who look up at the heavens and think that their senses are enough to tell them what the world is like. They don't use reason to figure out the motions of the heavenly bodies or appreciate the harmonies in the heavens. And so they come back as birds. Okay? Harmless creatures, but not very philosophical. More brute animals come from people who have no use for philosophy. They don't care about philosophy. They don't care about thinking about the world. They don't care about reason. They don't care about the ordered mind. So their punishment is they come back as ruminant quadrupeds. And the gods give them bodies that, not content with having 2 feet stuck on the ground, they have to have 4. And their head now is bent down to look at the earth. Mankind, on the other hand, has his head lifted up and can look at the stars in the sky, right? But the quadrupeds can't do that. Right? So their unfitness comes from the neglect and the improper use of their minds. Well, the Timaeus is not, therefore, primarily a natural philosophical work. But in terms of the history of science, that really doesn't matter a lot, because it came to be seen as such, and it came to represent Plato's thought, it came to represent the transformative nature of knowledge, it came to represent ideas about the way the world was created. Why did people care? Well, out of all the works of classical antiquity, the Timaeus was the one that impressed the 3 monotheistic religions the most. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all looked at the Timaeus and found things that they could agree with. What are those things? The world is created and not eternal. Okay? Aristotle, for example, says the world is eternal. The world is created by a single, one God, not a pantheon. That God is good, eternal, and, as Plato says, pleased with his creation. And God saw what he had made, and it was good. So the opening chapters of Genesis have a certain affinity with the Timaeus. Thirdly, The world is created by intelligent design, not by chance. None of this nonsense of atoms coming together randomly. None of this stuff from Empedocles about the four elements coming together randomly. No, there's a guiding principle, a divine guiding principle that creates the world. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the study of nature serves to illustrate its design. And whose design is that? The Creator's design. So it teaches about the Creator and directs the wise man towards right living. Okay? Well, just to give you a couple of quick examples of this, by the 1st century BC, Philo Judaeus, Philo the Jew, an important thinker of the Jewish community in Alexandria, adopted Platonic thinking, saying that the Platonic ideas are within the mind of God. So he's changed this idea of the demiurge looking at the forms and using matter into the forms are within God's mind. In the 4th and 5th century AD, St. Augustine adopts Platonic thinking. He says, of all the ancients, there are none so close to us Christians as the Platonists. What he's really adopting is Neoplatonic thought, which is a further development of Plato, but nonetheless, Augustine's statement's very important. It has a lot of impact. People keep reading Plato for these moral messages. Well, let's summarize what we have to say about Plato. Because there's several conclusions that should be drawn about Plato's impact on scientific thought. Let's talk about observation first. Plato's comments on the value of observation of sense perception are a little bit mixed. On the one hand, observation of natural objects focuses by necessity on the imperfect physical objects of this world, which are only, remember, dim reflections of the eternal forms, which knowledge of which constitutes real knowledge. Our real knowledge is the knowledge of forms, but we can't get that just by observing the world. The fate of the men that were turned into birds exemplifies the need for the natural philosopher to do more than simply observe nature. He's got to seek out the causes and the meanings of nature. Now, those two things are very important because modern science doesn't necessarily look at both of those. It tends to look at causes, but not necessarily meanings. For Plato, both of them are important. And we'll see for Aristotle, Plato's student, they're also both important. On the other hand, there are the problems with observation, but observation is good because it's the starting point for the rational ascent to the realm of the forms. It's the only way we can get there. In fact, the Timaeus says that vision is man's greatest ability. Why? Because it allows us to look out and see what else is in the world. It creates for us what he calls the art of number. I wonder why he says that. Maybe it's because when we see objects, we see that there's more than one, and so we naturally 1, 2, 3, 4 start counting them, and it immediately gives us an idea of number and thence of mathematics. From there, then, it's just a small step to philosophy, and from that, philosophy is, as Plato says, man's greatest good. It tells us how to live right. It tells us about the world. Observation of the natural world and the discovery of the abstract laws governing it reveal the evidence of order and design in the world. What does that mean? It means that the study of nature, this is important, really think about this, the study of nature has a morally or religiously didactic purpose. In other words, we improve ourselves morally by looking at the world, because the world is the example, the perfect creation, as perfect as he could, above the demiurge, right? So we need to make ourselves perfect and harmonious like that. Plato says it's hard to find the creator, another thing that would have a lot of resonance with Christian thought. But the study of nature is one way, and for Christians, this is very important in later centuries. The study of nature is a way to learn about God. Another point. The existence of perfect forms which are inaccessible to our direct observation implies that key truths are separate from material objects, which feeds into the notion that principles must be abstracted from sense data. This is widely perceived in the modern world as a key scientific principle, the ability to abstract universal ideas from material objects and observations. We do that, moreover, in a mathematical way most of the time in modern science, and that too owes a debt to Plato, this importance of the mathematical nature of the world. This comes clear in a challenge that Plato gave to astronomers that we're going to talk about a couple of lectures hence. So, now that we've seen Plato, we need to go to his most famous student, namely Aristotle. And the next two lectures will concentrate on Aristotle's contributions.